Today's guest is the man, the myth, the legend, Scott Horton. For those of you who don't know, and you should know, but if you don't, I'm going to tell you anyway, Scott Horton is a prominent American journalist, author, and radio host known for his focus on national security, foreign policy, and human rights. He is the director of the Libertarian Institute, the editorial director of antiwar.com, and host of the Scott Horton Show podcast. He is the author of several books, including Provoked, How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine, Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism, and Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan. Today we're discussing America's global war strategy to gain a deeper understanding of how the wars with Iran and Russia are interconnected and part of a sequence of battles leading up to the grand prize, China. We will also be discussing the pervasive influence of the Israel lobby on American foreign policy, particularly in the Middle East. So Scott, thank you so much for being with us today.
Happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
So Scott, you've done a lot of important work on the Russia-Ukraine war, exposing the Pentagon's plan to draw Russia into this conflict in Ukraine to degrade their military and exhaust them economically and politically with the hopes that it could break apart into smaller, more manageable microstates. You are very familiar with the military-industrial complex and the Pentagon's war plans for extending their global hegemony. It's no secret that the U.S. has opposition in different regions of the world that they seek to neutralize. It's Russia and Eastern Europe, Iran in the Middle East, and China in East Asia. Now, according to former Trump administration officials like A. Wes Mitchell, the U.S. plan has been to sequence these enemies, fighting them one at a time instead of all at once, in order to increase the odds of success, because these nations aren't these small, weak opponents that they're used to, like Syria, Libya, and Iraq. These are industrial powers. But this strategy of sequencing currently seems to be failing. It seems that NATO is the one who's bogged down in Ukraine and cannot pivot to China or Iran with full force without handing Russia a victory on the battlefield. So my question to you is, how do you interpret the wars with both Russia and Iran? Do you see them as interconnected?
Well, okay, there's a lot there. I mean, first of all, just one point of clarification. I think is really the White House's plan for the Ukraine war was to tell Putin that you better not do it. And if you do, we're going to back this, the Ukrainian side against you in whatever form. And they really were trying to talk him out of it. I think that was sincere. And they were declarative enough about it enough times. On the other hand, they clearly refused to negotiate in good faith to prevent it, because plan B was, well, and if they do invade, then that wouldn't be that bad, because then we can inflict this strategic defeat on them. Of course, hiding behind the bravery of Ukrainians who volunteer to go at the front. You don't want to let them down, do you? As Wesley Clark put it to me, again, the third time I debated him last week, that all that honor and all that bravery can't be for nothing. But when we're the ones who got them into this mess in the first place, right? And by following advice from the likes of him. So I wouldn't say that it was, and even then, I think that was the White House rather than the Pentagon in terms of who was really making this stuff up. And by the White House, who do I mean by that? I don't know. Jake Sullivan, maybe? Victoria Nuland? Joe Biden, I mean, somewhat, right? He was the president, and the guy sitting in the chair, he was the one that they took the plans to have him okay, right? So, anyway, but overall, I think, you framed the question correctly, that American foreign policy really since the end of the Cold War, without much adjustment, has been to pursue unilateral hegemony over the planet. And as they wrote, and this was the Pentagon's plan back in, the defense planning guidance, although it was Zalmay Khalilzad and Scooter Libby working for Paul Wolfowitz. So I don't know if that really counts as the Pentagon, but maybe it does. It was the neoconservatives at the Pentagon after the first Iraq War and the end of the Cold War who said, now that we're the unipolar power and the Soviet Union is gone, they called it the bipolar world. You have to pick one side. And of course, there was the third world, so-called, or the unaligned movement and all of that. But basically, in terms of powers of the earth, there was Moscow and Washington. Well, now Moscow had all fallen apart. Their empire had all fallen apart. So now as America bestrides the world alone, and this was, as Charles Krauthammer put it, our unipolar moment, where we're going to essentially build up a military force enough and create security arrangements with the other powers of the earth as such that no one's even going to try to build up their own military to be able to challenge ours or compete with ours. We'll be the global hegemon. Yes, in other words, we'll tolerate national governments having militaries, of course, but we won't tolerate anyone trying to build the kind of navy that could dominate the planet the way ours does, or to build up enough of a conventional air force, for example, I guess, to think that they could challenge us in Europe or something like that. Now, we would go to war with them first, and we'd prevent any nation or combination of nations, as they put it, from coming together to form a bloc big enough really to resist our power. But of course, this is all for the good of mankind, because the Americans are the best of all the world rulers. And would you prefer the Russians or the Chinese do it, is how they always put it. So it has to be us instead of no one. And refusing to recognize that for those able to resist it, they will resist it, right? So not to give the man any credit whatsoever, but it is just the fact of history that Bill Clinton made a deal with Kim Jong-il in North Korea that kept them from nuclear weapons, that kept their heavy water reactor off that the Soviets had built for them. They already had kept it off in exchange for these promises. And we're not coming for you, and we'll work toward normalization. We have the sunshine policy, and someday there's a brighter future we're working towards here. So be cool. And then Bush came in and started pushing them around. And I could give you the litany, but it's all there, if you want to look. And they decided to, if you want to ask me that on a follow-up, I'd be happy to. But anyway, they decided, okay, fine then. And they withdrew from the treaty, kicked the inspectors out, turned their reactor back on, started harvesting plutonium out of the thing, and made nuclear weapons. And now they have a couple of dozen. Could be making, many more than that. I don't know if anybody really knows. They're estimated to have at least a couple dozen nukes to protect. And we're talking about little old bankrupt North Korea, the hermit kingdom, right? With a GDP of nothing. But with independence, they can make nuclear weapons, and they have been able to do so. And of course, thanks to the Soviets for giving them the reactor in the first place, but still. And so, of course, the same thing with Russia and China. When America's attitude towards Russia is, look, man, we're going to do whatever we want, wherever we want. And quite frankly, we don't care what you think about it. It's not that we hate you and we're trying to destroy you. It's just that, what are you going to do? Yeah, that's what I thought. In the manner of just a basic teenage bully, right? That's exactly just how they act. And of course, well then, how do you think the Russians are going to react? And as I demonstrate in the book, as Joe Biden himself said, no Russian leader has ever thrown in with the West as hard as Vladimir Putin, right? And of course, it's Joe Biden who completes kicking him out of the West as best as he can and trying to push him toward the East, because Joe Biden is that horrible of a man and a politician and a strategist and the rest. But the thing of it is, first of all, America has really no business, trying to dominate Europe forever and all this anyway. But all other things being equal, Putin thought he had a partner in W. Bush. But then W. Bush did nothing but disrespect him, and including coddling the butchers of Beslan, right? Where W. Bush came out after the Beslan attack, which is just one of Russia's many 9/11s that have happened to them at the hands of at least formerly backed American and Saudi and British backed terrorists. And, in this case, directly backed by the United States and their allies. And Bush came out and said, you should negotiate with the terrorists down there. We're on their side. They're freedom fighters, and you're the imperialist in Chechnya and the North Caucasus. And to Putin, this is just 3 years after September 11th, right? And Putin just freaked out. How in the world can this be your attitude when, and quite rightly, I don't think he said this, but I would, that the United States had declared war against bin Ladenite style Sunni jihadi, stateless terrorism from Nigeria to the Philippines. But in Chechnya, we still like them because they're killing Russians, even though they're not the commies anymore, even though supposedly they're our friends now. But nope, whatever, old habits die hard or something. So we're just going to keep doing them that way anyway. Even at the heart of the terror wars, right? At the heat of the terror wars in 2004, we're talking about here, right? A year into Iraq, a year into the hype of Iraq War II, or 2-3 years into that. If you can remember, you might be too young. But and then, of course, there was the endless NATO expansion the emplacement of so-called defensive missiles, but they're fired from dual-use launchers that can host Tomahawk cruise missiles. And this was, in the lead up to, and then eventually we had the tearing up of the INF Treaty, which the Russians now say they're no longer abiding by either, and they are going to go ahead and install medium-range missiles in Europe again for the first time since 1987. Thanks a lot to everybody involved in that. It was Trump that tore up that treaty, Ronald Reagan's great achievement of 1987, to get all short, medium, and intermediate range missiles out of Europe. Now they're coming back. And so, what did you think he was going to do? If it was drunken, just corrupt to the bone old Boris Yeltsin, that'd be one thing. But Putin's corruption only goes so far. He cleptocratic has the interests of maintaining the integrity of his nation state as one of his high priorities, right? He's not just a kleptocrat. I'm sure he is one, but I'm just saying he's not just that. And of course he's going to react. In fact, Jack Matlock, the former ambassador to the USSR, asked him in a public forum years ago when he was still allowed in polite company in New York City, I believe it was. And Matlock said, come on, man, don't you know the missile defense systems are just corporate welfare? They barely even work. And they're really just to soak the taxpayer and give taxpayer these connected companies. And so it's really not that big of a deal. And you shouldn't overreact. Don't you think that, And Putin says, listen, first of all, that's crazy. Why don't you subsidize biotech or something instead of subsidizing missile defense system companies? Why has it got to be them, right? But then secondly, and then he says something to the effect of, I'm pretty sure I have this right in the time frame, that listen, I like George W. Bush. He likes me. We are friends, and I trust him. However, this isn't a matter of trust, right? I have certain responsibilities. I'm in charge of security here. And if you're going to ring my country with so-called defensive missile sites from dual-use launchers, well, I have to take that seriously. Now, I can either build more defensive launchers myself, or I can just build more and heavier offensive missiles. Which do you think is cheaper? And which do you think makes more sense from the Russian point of view to do? And then we know it's just a few years after that, in 2018, that Putin gave a big speech where he announced the whole new generation of nuclear weapons that they've been working on since W. Bush tore up the ABM treaty and announced that he was embarking on this project. And so now they have new nuclear torpedoes, new heavy missiles that can go around the South Pole with up to 24 MIRVs on them. They call it the Satan II heavy rocket. They claim that they've developed a nuclear-powered cruise missile that has essentially unlimited range. It could fly around any defenses to reach any target anywhere in the world. And of course, the hypersonics, which we've seen in action, including, multiple warheads being deployed at hypersonic speeds. In other words, impossible to shoot down with conventional anti-ballistic missile defenses. And so, great job, W. Bush, and Obama, and the rest of the entire and Bill Clinton, and the entire rest of the American foreign policy establishment. Everybody who framed Donald Trump in his first term for treason, who prevented America from just having a normal relationship. It doesn't mean we've got to do everything that they say and that, whatever. But again, all things being equal, I'm a non-interventionist here, but I'm just saying, again, as I cite in the book, I do cite the heroes like Ron Paul and Pat Buchanan and Ted Carpenter and all these great people who are, our friends who warned ahead of time. It's a pretty thick book, so they're a very marginal part of it. I don't really cite them as authorities, just as moral authorities. See, good men warned you. But then the real point is in the book is bad men warned you too. And the people who did this knew better all along and did it anyway. The consensus at the Council on Foreign Relations was we should not expand NATO. And then they did it anyway, right? We should not do all these provocative things. And then they did it anyway. What we should do is we should come up with a special status for Ukraine, guarantee their permanent neutrality so that us and Russia don't end up fighting over them, because what could happen? Russia could invade the east of the country and kill a bunch of people and destroy and wouldn't that be terrible? So we better do the right. That's Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski talking, right? Never mind Justin Raimondo writing at antiwar.com. But these guys said, now listen, we know we told you to do all this stupid stuff, but we are saying that you should pull your punch here, though. Don't go that far, because you're going to start a horrible war. And then they did it anyway. W. Bush's declaration at Bucharest in 2008. Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, ambassador to Russia, the entire National Security Council told him not to do it. The Germans or the French begged him not to do it. He did it anyway. War broke out in Georgia. Georgia started it just 4 months later because they wanted to settle their border dispute so that they could join NATO. They had, these breakaway provinces. Anyway, I'm sorry, I forgot. This is a real short show. So then as far as China goes, look, China is the near peer, right? America helped to make China rich, gave them the most favored nation status and all of these things. And the thing is about it is I think we could have just been friends with them. Doesn't mean that they were ever going to become a democracy or be whatever all of Washington wanted. But there's no reason for us to have all this tension with them other than it says in the textbook that when there's a rising power, you have to do everything you can to contain them and the rest. But there's no real reason to think that they have ambitions to go to South Korea, Japan, or Australia or anything like that. And so, I mean, they got plenty of expanding to do even inside their giant empire they already have owned for 1,000 years over there. They've got a tremendously poor population and all kinds of work to do. No reason to think that they have these global ambitions to replicate America's murder-suicide campaign that we've been on lately. The idea, that's the conception, is that they're rising, so we have to do everything we can to check them. This is a big part of the Russia policy, and I guess the Iran policy as well, is do everything we can, although the Iran policy is really all wrapped up with Israel more than anything, because we could just befriend Iran and it'd be fine. But it is a matter of trying to keep these countries away from China, which of course is a net energy importer. It's always been part since the first Gulf War. It's always been part of why America needs to dominate the Persian Gulf. We're not dependent on that oil. The price at the pump for the average guy trying to get to work in the morning is not dependent on the empire in the Persian Gulf. It's just that if there's war with China or any kind of emergency, we want to be able to cut them off. We want to be able to lord it over those oil supplies by closing the straits or shutting down any shipping to them. It's all part of the continuing Cold War, really. And so then this is part of the Russia policy, has always been, do we want to befriend them and pull them west to keep them away from China? Or do we want to beat them up real good and bog them down in Eastern Europe to keep them away from China, right? When in fact, that second policy has been really disastrous. It's cost America much more than Russia. And other than in men, but in terms of dollars, we are absolutely as bogged down as they are in the same crisis. And we've done essentially everything we can to not, their culture is what it is, but their economy has been essentially just kicked right out of Europe. So they have to do everything they can to expand all their ties in Asia rather than in Europe. And so how we go back to a normal relationship with Russia after this is anyone's guess. It's just been 25 years of just absolute idiocy. The most incompetent people as the stewards of American power. And here they threaten, as you know, they entertain the idea that we could fight, the United States, NATO could fight Russia, and or the American Navy could fight China in the China Straits or over Taiwan in the Pacific, when, of course, that would mean thermonuclear war. We can't have wars with these countries directly. We can have these horrible proxy wars is bad enough, and those are always in danger of spiraling out of control. But you can read entire studies. Michelle Flournoy, who was the Deputy Secretary of Defense for Policy under Obama and was a huge booster of the Afghan surge and all of that. She said, well, listen, we just need a war plan where we just send in the B-1 bombers and everything, and we just sink China's entire Navy in one shot, and that'll teach them that they can't mess with us. Well, but then you might lose L.A. and Denver and D.C., lady. Like, what are you talking about? Don't you know that China's sitting on a few hundred ICBMs tipped with hydrogen bombs? What do you mean you're going to sink their entire Navy? Then what? You're going to leave them helpless and they're going to just say, well, I guess we live in a world where we're helpless now and not do anything back? It's insane the way these people talk. You would think that they forgot that H-bombs even exist. And it's all for essentially like any group of idiots, right? Sitting around a table agreeing with each other is how they know that they're right. And nobody ever wakes them up to how completely lost they are, how completely, up their own rear ends they are with their great plans for full spectrum dominance is what Flournoy calls it, which of course threatens all of our entire existence.
I'd like you to expand on this. I'd like you to expand on this a little bit more if you can, because earlier you mentioned that Henry Kissinger, who is like notorious for many of the, hawkish American foreign policy plans over the many decades, even he warned the U.S. not to pursue this strategy of trying to recruit Ukraine and producing this potential war with Russia. So why is it that these people can leave the American foreign policy establishment or retire and then suddenly have a clear head? But then, like the woman you just described, she's still part of the establishment, and it's just like, what is it? An echo chamber of just like, does the system itself just force you to become as hawkish and as aggressive as possible until you leave, and then you can start seeing clearly?
I think you sum it up perfectly, right? I mean, just it's all the job incentives built into the thing. You don't get promoted at the Pentagon saying, we don't need to be doing all this. You get promoted at the Pentagon by saying, yeah, we do too, right? Michelle Flournoy made her career being, at the Center for a New American Security and in the Pentagon, flogging for war. When she's not at the Pentagon, she's at the think tank. And then she was part of West Executive Advisors, which is what? They're consultants who help corporations get military contracts. And then she lives in a giant mansion. You know what I mean? I'm sure she's absolutely making bank. Her and Antony Blinken were running that thing while Trump was in charge during Trump 1. That was their, halfway house after leaving the Obama administration, but waiting to come in for Biden. And in fact, even waiting for the advent of Obama was the Center for New American Security and flogging for the surge in Afghanistan. Now, man, I got to tell you, like, it ain't just that I was right about this, but I do a radio show. A lot of people were right about this, that escalating the Afghan war was completely stupid. And sitting here saying, well, what we're going to do is we're going to replicate what we did in Iraq. And then, first of all, that's stupid. But then secondly, that's not what they did, right? Back the local Sunni insurgency against the foreign fighters in the awakening. That's not what they did in Afghanistan. They took the whole thing to the Taliban as though they were invaders. When if they were following that model, it would have been backing the Taliban against ISIS, which is what they ended up doing. And of course, they were the ones who helped create ISIS there in the first place. But that's all in fool's errand. But that at least would have been them attempting to replicate the thing. They're not even replicating the thing. They're trying to foist a coalition of minorities onto the plurality population of the country. And we've all known all along it's going to fail. There's no one in the Obama government was willing to say that. In fact, even Gates and Mullen and Petraeus and everybody at the table ended up later throwing Hillary Clinton under the bus for taking their side. Because there they are pushing Obama to do the surge. And Hillary Clinton is the Secretary of State. It's her job to say, well, Mr. President, a more diplomatic approach might be this or that. And she says, and everybody knows that Obama wants to be more minimal and do less worse than they're demanding. And then she gives him no, as Gates put it, no running room whatsoever. And says, nope, I agree with Gates and Petraeus. You got to give them everything they want, Mr. President. You know what I mean? Because why? Because she wants to run for president. And she's a woman and a Democrat, so she needs to be muscular and tough. Even though she lost to Obama because she was so muscular and tough on Iraq, what's the first priority she has when she gets into government? We got to go to Libya so that in 2016, I could stand on, I did Libya and it worked way better than Bush's Iraq did. See, I know what I'm doing, which of course by 2016, she didn't want to talk about Libya at all because it was an absolute disaster and Al-Qaeda and ISIS were empowered and slavery was relegalized and it was a complete catastrophe. But that was her thinking at the time. That was why she needed to do it. And her own emails say that back and forth with her advisors like Sidney Blumenthal. They're like, yeah, you own this, Madam Secretary. This is your war and you're going to be able to run on this in 2016. This is your huge, important legacy building move for your future presidency, was the way it was framed to her, in the emails back and forth with her friends. So we know that was what was on her mind at the time. You know what I mean? It was that simple. Those kinds of idiot and not that simple because there were other factors as well. But those kinds of idiot personal individual incentives like money and career options matter a lot for how the overall system continues to bring us these, tragic outcomes, quite frankly, right? These disasters everywhere they go.
So speaking of disasters, the Ukraine war is not going well. And it seems like a lot of people have turned their attention away because Russia is slowly crawling, but at some point, many people are expecting that the line will completely collapse, and then the territorial gains will become great and it will escalate quickly. What is your current assessment of the war? And a second part to that question is, Trump is about apparently to go meet Putin. What are they potentially going to discuss, given that Russia can get whatever they want on the battlefield instead of just negotiating for it?
Yeah. All right. So first of all, in the war, you framed it exactly right. The Russians are winning slowly. They still, however, are far short of their territorial claims, right? So they're fighting this war of attrition where they're just trying to grind up the Ukrainian army. And then, as you say, once the line is broken, then they can just go where they want. I mean, like a third of Kherson is on the other side of the river. They're not crossing that until they can without fire. You know what I mean? There's no reason for them to lose a bunch of men. Boy, the Ukrainians lost a lot of Marines trying to take the other side of Kherson back, just pouring them into the, drowning them out there, basically, in a disastrous move. So at that point, then they could just take all 4 oblasts right up to the lines wherever they want to draw them, the 4 that they've claimed in the war. I'm skeptical of that, not because I have inside knowledge about what the conversations are in Moscow about exactly how far they want to play this. I just think of it like a libertarian, meaning examining government behavior, like how these things happen. Is the same thing in the United States, where they fail upwards. So the worse a disaster they make for themselves, the more excuse they have to keep going. And I think, strong executive action can overrule that, right? Like maybe H.W. Bush stopping before going all the way to Baghdad or something that Putin could call a halt, of course. But the logic is that, well, now that we've taken so many Russians out of Ukraine, pro-Russian, quote unquote, Russian-leaning candidates will never win for president again. We'll never have a majority in the parliament, ever. Impossible, right? The Donbass is gone. So then what about the other ethnic and Russian speakers east of the Dnieper River who now are going to be an even smaller and helpless minority in the land, say, Dnipropetrovsk there, which I'm saying wrong, but the big province between the river and Donetsk. Well, what about them? Don't we have to protect them too? So now they go all the way to the river, but now they can see Kiev right across the river. And then they also have to their north, Sumy and Kharkiv. And Kharkiv, geez, that's a historic Russian city. And now we're talking about at a time where the Ukrainian military presumably is broken and the Russians can more or less do what they want, at least east of the river. They're going to go ahead and take the city of Kharkiv too, shell it and force all the people to flee and then just move in or fight a brutal war for it. And then what about Odessa? They could claim again that, hey, this is a historic Russian city. And so, and of course, not only might they want to, they might want to deprive Ukraine of it, the jewel of the Black Sea, this most important port, and leave Ukraine landlocked. In fact, might as well, once you take Odessa, go all the way to Transnistria, which is, as your audience may know, a strip of land on the Moldovan side of the river, on the Moldovan-Ukrainian border, that has Russian peacekeeping troops, so-called there, and is land essentially controlled by Russia, even though it's officially a part of Moldova. And so that's one of these so-called frozen conflicts. Well, there's an easy solution to that. You just take the entire southern coast of Ukraine all the way to Transnistria, or Transdniester, it's sometimes called. And then, so you own all of that too. And then you get to really screw your enemies in Lviv and everybody in Western Ukraine, that now you get to take their port away. And then, you love them so much, Poland, you take them. And by the way, now you've left a rump state controlled by Nazis who absolutely hate you in a religious way, right? Like to the nth degree, where you have no balance whatsoever against the most right-wing people in the far west of the country. And so now that's going to be the leadership of the rump Ukraine, is going to be Andriy Beletsky, the war hero from the 3rd Separate Infantry Division, or now it's called the 3rd Army Corps. If he lives through this war, he's very likely to be the dictator of the new Ukraine. They'll call him the White Rex. That was his nickname. They go, White Rex, Der Fuhrer, the leader, Andriy Beletsky. And he's, he's earning the street cred now. And so then now what? Now what does Moscow do with that? Now you got to keep going. So there, you see what I mean about how they're just digging themselves this grave. It would be, I just saw Mearsheimer explaining this to Tucker, last week or whatever. We get any kind of good ceasefire here. Now it's still a frozen conflict. And in other words, we got a ceasefire, but it's unresolved. Like you could even say North and South Korea, that's a pretty permanent ceasefire there. But just getting a ceasefire in the east of Ukraine with so many issues left unresolved in that way, I think is just hitting the pause button. Donald Trump, I don't know, let's say he leans on Putin with everything he's got and he begs and pleads and promises him everything that he has to. And then Putin says, okay, fine. We'll call a timeout here as long as the Ukrainians will give in on this and this and this, and does that. And still, where does that leave us for 5 or 10 years from now? Right? Where, in other words, sort of like in your question, the point being that Donald Trump doesn't have any really good arguments to make about why the side that, not him, quite honestly, but his predecessor, helped to provoke this war and cause this war to happen. Now it's like, oh, you started it, now I'm finishing it. And then our side is trying to call timeout before the side we're backing is done losing. So from the point of view of the other side, and again, but this is an important point too. From Moscow's point of view, how can you trust Washington? They could frame Trump for treason again tomorrow. They could shoot him in the face in Dallas. Like, who knows? And or just the Democrats could win next time, or just a store-bought GOP guy who's just going to do what the consensus in the Senate is, right? Which is always, Rubio's point of view, in other words, rather than anything conciliatory. So I think Putin has so little incentive to deal with the United States. And I think it sucks that he keeps shining Trump on and saying, yes, Donald, yes, and then not doing anything other than escalating the war. You can see Donald Trump gets his feelings hurt and goes, I talked to him on the phone and then he bombed the hell out of Kiev, and I take that personally. You don't want that, man. Don't do that. Be honest. Tell Trump, look, I'm going to bomb the hell out of Kyiv tonight. I'm mad and I'm doing what I'm going to do. But ain't no point in manipulating the president of the United States, especially one as emotional as this. You see what he already did. It was like, well, I'm going to start sending weapons again then, and all of this. And it just sucks, man. It's really unfortunate because I do think that Donald Trump is sincere that he wants to end this war. And I think he's sincere that, there's reason to believe, unlike the situation in Gaza, for example, there's real reason to believe that if he had been the president, the Ukraine war would not have happened because he would have dealt reasonably with the Russians and prevented it from breaking out in the first place. And it was preventable. It absolutely was. And so I think he really does want to end it, but he just doesn't have any cards to play. Joe Biden already played all the carrots and all the sticks, not many carrots. We don't have that many carrots to offer. Trump said, look, I'll normalize relations with you. But again, you could see that just falling on deaf ears. They're like, well, I just don't believe you. You know what I mean? Obama promised to drop all the sanctions on Iran if they cooperated with the JCPOA. He never did. Bill Clinton promised to ship welfare and fuel oil over to North Korea, light water reactors, if they would stay in the deal. He never lived up to his end of it. You know what I mean? So if you're the Russians, and especially when the leader over there is considered the absolute Satan figure in Washington, D.C., then how are things going to be in 3 years from now? You would have to bet that they're not going to be in your favor, right, if you're in their position. So it leaves the poor Ukrainians in a very difficult spot because they're just not done losing yet, but they sure are losing, and meaning in terms of their population, the individual human lives, but just the overall destruction of their society. It's just terrible. All the refugees and all the displacement and all the dead and wounded and everything is just a disaster.
Yeah, it's a massive tragedy. As you mentioned, Ukrainian refugees all over the European continent, but also parts of the Middle East. They're kind of just getting scattered everywhere. And that's not even mentioning all the Ukrainian men who died, bleeding out in the mud. So it's a horrible tragedy. So
you know what people could have said about Vietnam? That listen, we've been backing this South Vietnamese army for 15 years now. And they have died for this thing to keep the commies out. We're going to now betray them and just let the commies take over the South? No way, man. We can't do it. Except, yeah, you can too. You have to. You can't stop it. What are you doing? You're getting these people killed for nothing. We should have just never invaded Vietnam in the first place. The commies whooped the French. That should have been the end of it, right? We lost all those men and we killed all those people for nothing. And I say people, not just men, because that's right. You know, it was the men of the South Vietnamese army we marched off into battle to be slaughtered. But then as all of the men, women, and children and elderly and everybody else caught up in the entire war, millions and millions of people killed, then we lost anyway. And all that stuff about, and we had to. There was nothing they were going to do about it. We were talking about fighting in the jungle and this counterinsurgency. He could have nuked North Vietnam, and the South Vietnamese insurgency still would have fought. Maybe they would have tripled down to fight and kick us out even harder, right? So sure, there's a bunch of, bright shining lies on TV about how this is noble and honorable and it's the right thing to sacrifice for goodness against evil and whatever. Nope. It was all a bunch of crap, all of it. Same thing for the brave men of the Afghan National Army who fought to keep the Taliban down. You want to betray their sacrifice? Yes, the sooner the better. The sooner the better. I'm sorry. That's business, man. That's the reality. And I told you, honestly, I did. In the Bush years, we can either leave now and watch the Taliban take back over, or we can leave in 5 years and watch them take over, or we can leave in 10 years or 15 or 20 or 25. When we leave, the government we put in power there is going to fall apart, and the locals are going to work it out, and that means that the Pashtuns are going to be dominant. And who's dominant among the Pashtuns? The Taliban. I mean, I said that in 04 and 05 and 06 just because it was true, not because I was a brilliant genius, but just because I cared and I wasn't a liar. I didn't have a vested interest in trying to make this pig look good. Here's some lipstick. Oh, no, we just got to train them harder. Are you kidding me? These people speak Urdu. They can't win a counterinsurgency against the Pashtuns. You know what I mean? It's completely insane. So
you've been following Empire very closely now. A lot of people get the sense that the Empire is rapidly declining. Is that your view of the American Empire?
yes, and look, I'll tell you where it hits, man. And this is what's happening to everyone across the board. Everybody feels it. Mostly they don't know exactly what's happening or why. And they may not even be able to make a direct correlation to the world empire, like out loud in English with a period at the end. But we all feel it. It's price inflation, man. Price inflation. And where's the price inflation come from? Artificial monetary expansion. Either the government just sending checks to everybody in the mail for COVID, including mostly to trillionaire corporations, not mom and pop getting their welfare check, although that was a huge expansion of the money supply under Trump and under Biden for the COVID thing. And then on top of that, we have what's called a fractional reserve banking system, which means that the Federal Reserve gives a license to the banks where whenever they loan out money, it's new money. So they have a reserve ratio. They can only loan out so much new money based on actual deposits that they have. But then again, those deposits might have just been printed out of nothing by that same bank or another bank, and then they treat that as reserves and expand bank credit even more. And so when you have the government buying up debt with brand new money and licensing the banks to expand their the money supply overall, what you have is what they call boom times, which most people feel as painful times. I mean, if you're a small business owner or something, you might do okay and like have some prosperity. There's real prosperity during the boom, but there's a lot of artificial prosperity, especially for the people who are the most connected and wealthiest. It's what they call, and I probably am pronouncing it wrong, I believe it's the Cantillon effects, named after this economist who explained that the people who get the new money, when they get it, it still has yesterday's value, right? By the time we get it as wages 6 steps down the chain, now it's devalued and is worth less. So it's the people lower down the chain who get the money last are subsidizing the people who get the money first. And that is welfare recipients, rich and poor, especially rich because they're getting the most. And especially, for example, the military industrial complex and all the government contractors that work even on dispersing the welfare. You know what I mean? For the poor, it's still huge corporations that are helping with all of that. So you have this system where in so-called good times, the rent is going up and up and up. Food prices are going up and up and up. Fuel prices are going up and up and up. And so if you're the beneficiary of that, great. Everybody else feels this as real heat and pressure. That's where we are right now. But then what's the solution to that? The correction, the bust. Now we're going to have sometime soon, not now, but it's coming at some point. We have the giant recession. And the giant recession that's the fix from all that artificially generated fake prosperity from the bubble times. And now our rent doesn't really go down, but our employment levels do, our hours at work do if we don't get entirely laid off. And so we get screwed coming and going. Regular people get screwed through inflation during the boom, and we get screwed from all of the consequences of the crash when the bust comes. And yet underlying all of this, and not just the empire, but definitely including empire, big government depends on inflationary money. You can't have hard money with a $7 trillion budget. You've got to be able to tax what you can, borrow what you can, and print the rest to maintain a system like that. And of course, the military budget and the overall imperial, well, not overall imperial budget, but not including the State Department, but just defense and the spy agencies and all their contractors and everything, is almost $2 trillion a year, including the VA. This is Winslow Wheeler, the great Pentagon spending critic, a real expert on this stuff, has tallied all that up. We're already at about $1.7 trillion a year just in militarism. And we're now paying more than that just for interest on the debt. So think about all of the people like in your state, everyone, all their income tax that they pay, money that they work for, that they needed to spend on their family and their quality of life. That money went just to pay the interest on the debt. All of it went to pay just the interest on the debt to some national sovereign bank sitting on U.S. government securities just to keep the house of cards going, right? We need a hard reset where we fire about 85% of the national government's employees, abolish all of these entitlement programs, starting with the empire. We cannot afford it. And this is, of course, a huge flaw in the argument that we need to do all this to prevent China from taking over the world. China can't afford to take over the world either. You think Xi Jinping is looking at George Bush and Barack Obama and Joe Biden and saying, yeah, that's what I want to do. Blow my country's brains out. Destroy everything that, that they have built since the right wing of the Communist Party took over in the late 70s after Mao died and they began to adopt capitalism over there. Oh yeah, you know what we should do? We should squander every bit of investment capital that we built up for ourselves here that we could invest in improving our own society. Why in the world would they do that? And who's going to loan them the money to do it once they break their budget, just like we have? So that's what it's all about, man. And so when people are sweating and they're looking at the price of groceries and they just can't understand, and that's what it is. It's the same reason it's a crime for you to counterfeit. It's the same reason that the government gives itself a license to counterfeit money. But think about why it's a crime, right? Like say you live in a small town, just easy to understand. You live in a small town, everybody passes the same money kind of around and around a lot. Sometimes a new guy comes to town, spends a little more, got a kind of small economy. Now you get a printing press and you start printing money. You could see how immediately as you spend that money into the economy in your local town, that now you have a vast increase in supply of dollars without an increase in demand for them. And so now the value of everybody's money goes down as you flood the local economy with your own new counterfeit currency, right? So you are essentially stealing out of the pockets of everybody virtually, right? You're tearing the corners off of their dollar bills in terms of value, but it's kind of invisible. Nobody knows what's happening until somebody busts you with your printing press and then you go to the pokey because that's a crime. That's stealing. Well, that's what our government does. Just they print George Washington's face on it and say, you have to use this to pay your taxes with. So you have no choice. And so that's our corrupt money system. And it's all built around being able to fund big government at the expense of freedom.
I want to ask you, in your view, why hasn't this big bust or recession come yet? I know that COVID was kind of like...
That was it. That was it. So if you go back, we had the big bubble in 99. And then the pop of the dot-com bubble, we had the big housing bubble that crashed in 2008. And we had all kinds of bubbles. I mean, you look at the charts of how much money Obama printed in the gigantic bubbles in all different sectors. And then what happened was, and remember, Trump always wants interest rates lower, lower, lower. He's always bullying the Fed chairman. Lower, lower, lower. So he's a real estate guy. He's not an Austrian school economist, but he knows when they start lifting up the interest rates, you're going to get a crash in his markets, right? And he wants, no matter what, for any crash to happen after he's gone, right? Look at what happened to W. Bush, where this is like his last 3 months in office, and the thing crashes down on him. You know what I mean? And it's like he's stuck with that forever instead of being able to blame it on the next guy, that kind of thing. So, but then, and you can go only as far as you want with this, but they really, the national government itself, and he went along with this out of idiocy to incredible degrees that people don't want to remember back now. The government essentially forced the recession the way Paul Volcker did in the late 70s and early 80s by just raising interest rates through the roof. Well, they did it with the lockdown, right? So like what happens when Paul Volcker jacks the interest rates way, way up is it means that all the marginal loans fail, right? Like nobody can afford, or not nobody, but only the very best position can afford to pay the loans at those interest rates, and all that other possible froth, bubble activity, and much more gets completely liquidated out of the economy and has to start over again. That's forcing that recession to beat the inflation again, right? It's their fault, and then they solve it by waging war against the problem that they cause, right? So the lockdowns of 20 and 21 were essentially the same thing, right? It was almost like bringing Paul Volcker back to raise the interest rates way up. They just made it illegal to do business, right? And so you just have so many fewer businesses going to the bank and taking out loans to expand and to participate in commerce at all. Just everything is just completely contracted. You had a massive stock market crash at the very beginning, remember? And then why did it rally? Just because they printed a bunch of money and shoveled it into the companies, into the biggest companies, right? At the expense of all of the millions of medium-sized and small businesses in the country are forced to subsidize the very richest ones in order to keep the market going. It was just new money. It wasn't new wealth. It was just new money went to them. And I'm such an idiot. I thought, man, I mean, I know we have a totalitarian state and everything like that, but these lockdowns, they can't last more than a couple of weeks because just business will revolt. And business, when I say business, I mean millions of businesses. Like you just can't do it. And then, but I'm such an idiot because, yeah, they can. They just print the money and bail out the biggest ones. And then everybody else will just be screwed, dude. That's the business lobby that really counts, is the very biggest guys. And they will land safely at the expense of everyone else. And so that was really like the short circuit in the boom bust cycle, just in the place of the bust. Right? But then what did they do? Again, as we're talking about, Trump signed the CARES Act and then Biden signed his own, I think 2 of them or whatever it was. And they just created so much new money and flooded. By one measure, it was 2/3 of all the dollars that had ever been created were created post-COVID. So this was like Obama on crack, just times, just out of, if you look at the charts, and I'm not the best at this, but you can, like this, the St. Louis Fed keeps all the best charts. You could go and look at the expansion of the money supply and the Fed's balance sheet and this and that and whatever, all those different statistics. And you can see how like M1, I guess, is there are different M1, M2, M3 are different measures of the money supply, but you go look at those and you see there's a massive inflationary boom that started that. And then once they lifted the lockdowns, then everybody went back to work. And then that was when you saw all that massive increase of dollars in everybody's pockets, then chasing even fewer goods around because all the supply chains have been screwed up and all of that. So it just caused this absolute massive pain. And then, for people who are, have a decent job and whatever, and some security and some savings and whatever, that's one thing. But when you're just a regular guy with a lower wage type job, and maybe especially younger people who haven't had a chance to build up their own kind of cushion or anything like that at all, then when your rent goes from $1,000 to $1,500 and then to $2,000, well, you're just screwed. And they'll take your kid away if you try to get an efficiency, right? You have to have a separate bedroom. And if you have 2 kids, you know what I mean? Like it's like living in Germany or something. So you have people lose their children, now they're sleeping outside when they're not, homeless drug addicts, except now they weren't, now they are. right? But it was the price inflation that kicked them out of their home, right? That made them, and then now that they're dirty, they can't go to work, and now they're screwed. And like the people really suffer from this stuff. I read a thing. I wish I'd thought of this. Makes perfect sense. But I read a thing about how a lot, I don't know what percentage it is, but maybe even a majority, or maybe not, but it was a large number of homeless drug addicts started out homeless, then became drug addicts because that's how you stay awake at night in order to not get beaten and robbed and raped and killed when you're sleeping outside. And so then people are like, okay, I guess I will take a bump of crank if it's going to keep me up till the sun comes up, kind of thing. And then, so it's just a spiral, man, because it's hard as hell living outside, you know? And people don't understand. This is the other thing about the boom and bust. I really remember this a lot from 08 and 09 and 010. Well, especially 9 and 10, you know, in the aftermath of the crash of 08, where, you know, I'm just a news junkie, man. I'm on this stuff all the time. That's all I do is read. And you just see it everywhere. I don't know the statistics. I'm afraid to look. But, and hell, I hope I don't get you censored from YouTube for saying the word. But suicides just went through the roof because people internalize all the shame of their failure just because the economy crashed because Ben Bernanke printed too much money. Him and Alan Greenspan printed too much money. Now the bust comes and people are like, well, I can't afford to take care of my family. And I'll be damned if I'm going to let some other man have them. So then they kill their whole family and then themselves. Right? It happened. Oh, I mean, it's a huge, I'm afraid to look at the statistics, but I'll tell you this, the Fed isn't. Because I know from the book Secrets of the Temple by William Greider that the Fed keeps statistics on divorces and bankruptcies, foster care, suicide, and all that. And they know it's all a function of them turning their dial on the interest rate. They know when they're causing this inflationary boom, and it's good for some people, but it's also driving up costs for people at the bottom and ruining their lives. They know the pain that causes, all the social consequences of that. And then same thing when they twist the knob the other way and jack the interest rates up in order to try to quell inflation, and they cause that recession, and they force even more people out of work and force even more economic hard times on people. They have the numbers. They keep up the charts. They know in which county, you know, they can tell you exactly where divorce rates are going up, where foster rates are going up, and then all of the consequences of that. Don't make me speak of that. Everybody knows. You know, and the suicides. And it's just completely tragic. And because I believe it was Henry Hazlitt that said that when, you know, because of the effects of price inflation or monetary inflation in the society, that not one man in 10,000 understands what is happening. Right. And then so you have a lot of internalizing the responsibility for being a failure, which is just not your fault that the factory closed, man. There are these massive economic forces at work that, like, to the average working guy might as well be up in heaven, right? It's like Mount Olympus stuff that they don't understand how the Fed works, who's manipulating interest rates and making the economy do this and that. They don't know that. All they know is they had a job to do, which is take care of their family, and now they can't. Right. And then so they blame themselves and eat a pistol over it. And so, but meanwhile, it's all because of the government printing money all day so they can afford to kill foreigners that we had no business messing with in the first place. So we can dominate the planet to keep it from spinning all out of control when it's no more dangerous than it ever was. And the most dangerous thing about it is America and our own foreign policy.
Very well said, Scott. This has been no, don't apologize. This has been a very insightful conversation. Really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. So where can people find more of your work? Obviously, I'm going to list your books, and I'll provide links in the description of this video so people can check out your books if they like. But is antiwar.com the best place to find your work? Is it your podcast? Where would you like to direct people?
Sure. Yeah, it's a long list. It's I need to like get a little note card and just hold it up.
Well, I'll list everything out in the description of the video.
It's scotthorton.org. That's all my interviews, 6,000 something of them going back to 2003 at scotthorton.org. My Substack is scotthortonshow.com, where you can start to listen to the audiobook of Provoked. It's not done yet, but I have the first 3 sections, which is the first 2 chapters, but that's already like 12 hours long, I think. Is it 9 or I think 12 hours long just for the first 2 chapters of the book. It's a big book. So that's all at scotthortonshow.com. And then I'm the director of the Libertarian Institute, which is me and a whole bunch of really great guys. Authors, writers, and podcasters are the very best of the libertarian movement over there, libertarianinstitute.org. We have a brand new book called Creative Chaos about Obama's dirty war for al-Qaeda in Syria 15 to 10 years ago by William Van Wagenen, and that should be hitting any day, like should be today, that it should go live on Amazon So we're real proud of that. We're on our like 16th or 17th book there. And then of course, yes, antiwar.com is the most important project on the internet. Although you can just find links to my show there, and whenever I occasionally write an article, but mostly that's Dave DeCamp, Eric Garris, and Kyle Anzalone, and friends Margaret Griffiths and others doing the great hard work to hold antiwar.com together over there. And then Amazon.com is where you buy my books, Fool's Errand, Enough Already, and Provoked.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'm going to get all this listed out. And again, people can click in the description to find links to all of the different...
Oh, wait, I forgot. I have a new podcast with Daryl Cooper, also called Provoked, which is at least the last 3 weeks. I don't know about the news going to hit today, I guess. The last 3 weeks is the number one new podcast on Apple Podcasts.
How could you forget that? How could you forget that?
I got a lot of jobs.
You got a lot going on. Yeah, I could tell. But that's awesome. So, wow, you said the fastest growing podcast over the last 3 weeks on Apple.
Yeah, they call it the number one new podcast. So
okay.
After the first week, we were in 8th place, right behind the Undertaker from the WWE, and then the next week after that, we were in 1st. And let's see if the new one has come out, because I usually get like a little Google alert for it, but at least last week, we were 3 weeks running. We're the number one new podcast on Apple. So we're doing pretty good. And people can check that out on YouTube as well.
Well, congratulations. And again, thank you for being here. I look forward to the next time, hopefully, that we can speak. So we covered so much today. I'm sure we could keep going and going. But I want to thank you for your time, and hopefully...
Yeah, and I'm sorry I didn't really answer very well about Iran. Maybe we'll do that next time.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I mean, you were so thorough on everything else, and honestly, you're just barely scratching the surface. I can tell that you're just a wealth of knowledge and information. So again, thank you for being here, and I look forward to the next time we speak.
Appreciate it.
Trust nothing. No law.